Rushing through JFK Airport with only minutes to spare, Grace grabbed what she thought was her boarding pass for a medical transport flight. But as the private jet lifted off the ground, she realized she'd made a terrible mistake. She was sitting across from a billionaire who thought she was his new assistant, and they were heading to Barbados instead of a medical conference. What happened during those 3 days in paradise would change both their lives forever. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I'm bringing you another story just as interesting and unforgettable as this one. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. Now, let's rewind to where it all began. Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Chicago. Grace Patterson's sneakers squeaked against the polished hospital floor as she rushed between rooms, her royal blue scrubs wrinkled from the 14-hour shift that was supposed to end 3 hours ago. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that familiar sterile glow that had become the backdrop of her life for the past 8 years. Grace! Room 314 needs pain meds, and Mrs. Henderson in 318 is asking for you again, called Nurse Patricia from behind the station, her voice carrying that edge of exhaustion they all knew too well. Grace tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear, the movement automatic after years of keeping it neat under her cap. Her brown eyes, usually bright with compassion, showed the fatigue of someone who'd given everything to everyone else. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to be strong because she had no other choice. She grabbed the medication chart, her fingers brushing against the small silver cross necklace her grandmother had given her, the one piece of jewelry she never took off, even during the longest shifts. I'll handle Mrs. Henderson first. She's been anxious all evening. Room 318 was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes, looked up as Grace entered. "There's my angel," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her voice paper-thin but warm. "I was hoping you'd come by before your shift ended." Grace pulled up the chair beside the bed, her movements gentle despite her exhaustion. "I wouldn't leave without saying goodnight. How are you feeling?" "Better now that you're here." Mrs. Henderson's weathered hand found Grace's. "You remind me of my daughter. She was a nurse too, you know. Always putting others first." Grace squeezed the woman's hand softly. "Was? Cancer took her 5 years ago. She was about your age." Mrs. Henderson's eyes grew distant. "Promise me something, dear. Don't forget to live your own life while you're busy saving everyone else's." The words hit Grace deeper than she expected. She'd heard variations of this advice before, but tonight, something about Mrs. Henderson's earnest expression made it stick. "I promise," she whispered, though she wasn't sure how to keep such a promise. After ensuring Mrs. Henderson was comfortable, Grace finally made her way to the break room. The December wind rattled the windows as she collapsed into one of the plastic chairs, her feet throbbing in her shoes. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her messages, rent due notice, her mother asking for help with grocery money, her sister's texts about college expenses. The break room vending machine hummed in the corner, and Grace stared at it longingly. She had exactly $8.47 in her checking account until payday, which was still 3 days away. The turkey sandwich she'd brought from home had been her dinner, and it would probably be breakfast too. Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate Kelly. "Girl, there's a letter here from some travel company. Says you won a contest? Looks official." Grace frowned. She'd never entered any contests. "What's it say?" "Something about a complimentary medical transport to Barbados for the St. Vincent Medical Conference. All expenses paid. Says to be at JFK tomorrow at 2 p.m., Terminal 4, Gate 23. Girl, this seems legit. Grace's heart skipped. She vaguely remembered filling out some survey online months ago about medical education opportunities. Could this actually be real? A chance to attend a Caribbean medical conference? It seemed too good to be true, but the exhaustion in Mrs. Henderson's words about living her own life made her want to believe. She quickly Googled the St. Vincent Medical Conference. It was real, happening December 16th to 18th in Barbados. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine it, warm sun instead of Chicago's bitter cold, learning from other medical professionals, maybe even having a single day to herself. Her supervisor, Nancy, poked her head into the break room. Grace, I know you're supposed to be off tomorrow, but Rodriguez called in sick for the morning shift. Can you cover? Grace looked at her phone, then back at Nancy. For 8 years, she'd never said no. Never put herself first. Never taken a single day that wasn't about someone else's needs. Actually, Nancy, I can't. I have plans. Nancy raised an eyebrow. Plans? You? Yeah. Me. Grace stood up, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. I'll be back Monday. Alexander Kane stood at the windows of his penthouse, looking out at the city that never slept, much like himself. At 35, he'd built an empire in tech and real estate, but tonight, surrounded by the trappings of success, he felt more isolated than ever. His reflection stared back at him from the window, tall, lean frame, dark hair that cost more to maintain than most people's monthly salary, and green eyes that business magazines called piercing but that he knew were just tired. He wore a simple white t-shirt and black pajama pants, the only time he allowed himself to dress down. The penthouse was immaculate, decorated by Manhattan's most sought-after interior designer, but it felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was perfect, pristine, and completely soulless. His phone buzzed on the marble counter. A text from his assistant, Margaret, your transport to Barbados is confirmed for 2 p.m. The merger documents are in your briefcase. This deal will make you officially the youngest billionaire in real estate. Congratulations, Mr. Kane. Alexander stared at the message. Another milestone, another billion, another empty victory. He'd be flying to Barbados to finalize the purchase of a resort chain, a deal that would cement his position in the hospitality industry. But the thought of another boardroom, another handshake, another newspaper headline filled him with a weariness that had nothing to do with the late hour. He walked to his bedroom, past the king-sized bed he slept in alone, past the walk-in closet filled with designer suits that all looked the same. On his nightstand sat a single photo, the only personal item in the entire penthouse. It showed a younger version of himself with his parents and his sister, all of them laughing at some long-forgotten joke during a family vacation to Cape Cod. That was before the accident. Before he'd inherited everything at 25. Before the weight of an empire had settled on his shoulders and everyone around him had started seeing dollar signs instead of a person. He picked up the photo, running his thumb over his sister's face. Rebecca would have been 33 now. She'd always been the one who kept him grounded, who reminded him that money was just paper and that real wealth came from the people you loved. "What would you do, Becca?" he whispered to the photo. Alexander set the frame down and walked to his home office, where 3 computer monitors displayed stock prices, property values, and profit margins. His entire life reduced to numbers and charts. He was worth more than some small countries, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed. Really laughed. His phone rang, his mother, calling from their family home in Connecticut. "Alexander? I hope I didn't wake you." "I was already up, Mom. Is everything okay?" I'm fine, sweetheart. I was looking through old photo albums tonight, and I found pictures from when you and Rebecca were children. You were so happy then, so full of life. Alexander closed his eyes. Mom, I know you think I worry too much, but you're my son. All this success, all this money, what's the point if you're not happy? When was the last time you went somewhere just for yourself? Not for business, not for a deal, just because you wanted to? I don't have time for. You have all the time in the world, Alexander. You own time. But you're wasting it. After his mother hung up, Alexander sat in the silence of his office, surrounded by the evidence of his success and the emptiness of his life. Tomorrow he'd fly to Barbados, sign papers, make another fortune, and fly home to this beautiful, perfect, lonely prison. He walked back to the window, watching the city lights twinkle below. Somewhere out there, people were living real lives, making real connections, finding real happiness. And here he was, 35 years old with everything money could buy and nothing money couldn't. The alarm on his phone chimed, 4 a.m. In 10 hours, he'd be on his way to Barbados for another business trip that would change everything about his life, though he had no way of knowing it yet. Alexander Kane, the man who could buy anything, was about to discover that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased at any price. The chaos of JFK Airport during holiday season was like stepping into a hurricane of rolling suitcases, crying babies, and the constant drone of departure announcements. Grace Patterson stood in the middle of Terminal 4, clutching her boarding pass and feeling completely out of place in her best outfit, a burgundy sweater dress that she'd owned for 3 years and black flats that were comfortable enough for her 12-hour shifts. She'd taken the red-eye from Chicago with butterflies dancing in her stomach, using the last of her savings for the flight. The letter had been legitimate. She'd called the number, spoken to a cheerful woman who confirmed her spot at the medical conference. It still felt surreal, like she was living someone else's life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Kelly, "Have the best time, girl. You deserve this more than anyone. Send me pictures of the beach." Grace smiled, tucking her phone into her small black purse. She'd packed everything she owned that seemed appropriate for a tropical medical conference into one borrowed suitcase. 3 sundresses, her 1 pair of sandals, and enough professional clothes to get her through the presentations. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She approached Gate 23, scanning the waiting area for other medical professionals. Instead, she found herself surrounded by people in expensive suits talking on phones about stock prices and merger deals. A woman in a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than Grace's monthly rent was arguing with someone about quarterly projections. "Excuse me," Grace approached the gate agent, a tired-looking man in his 50s. "I'm here for the medical transport to Barbados." "Grace Patterson." The agent barely looked up from his computer. "Gate 23, departure in 15 minutes. You can board now." Grace hesitated. "Are there other medical professionals on this flight? I thought it was a group transport." "Lady, I just scanned tickets. Your name's on the list, you're good to go." She walked through the jetway, her heart racing with anticipation. This was it, her first real adventure, her first time putting herself first. Mrs. Henderson's words echoed in her mind, "Don't forget to live your own life." The sight that greeted her at the aircraft door made her stop dead in her tracks. This wasn't the commercial medical transport she'd expected. This was a private jet, sleek, luxurious, with leather seats that looked like they belonged in a 5-star hotel. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, and the lighting was warm and inviting. "Welcome aboard," said a flight attendant in an impeccable Navy uniform. "Ms. Patterson, I presume?" Mr. Kane is already seated. May I take your coat? Grace's mouth went dry. Mr. Kane? I think there's been a mistake. I'm here for the medical conference transport. The flight attendant smiled politely. Of course. Right this way. Grace followed her down the narrow aisle, her mind racing. Maybe this Kane person was another medical professional? Maybe he was the conference organizer? She tried to rationalize what was happening, but nothing made sense. And then she saw him. Alexander Kane was seated in a cream-colored leather chair, his attention focused on a tablet displaying what looked like financial documents. He wore a navy blue suit that was clearly tailored to perfection, and when he looked up at the sound of footsteps, Grace felt her breath catch. He was handsome in that understated way that didn't try too hard, strong jawline, dark hair with just a hint of silver at the temples, and the most striking green eyes she'd ever seen. But it was the brief moment of confusion that crossed his face when he saw her that made her realize something was very, very wrong. I'm sorry, he said, standing with fluid grace. I think there's been some confusion. I'm Alexander Kane, and I believe you're... Grace Patterson, she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm supposed to be on a medical transport to Barbados for the St. Vincent Medical Conference. Alexander's eyebrows rose slightly. Medical conference? I think there's been a mistake. I'm flying to Barbados for a business acquisition. My assistant arranged this flight. Grace felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Oh God, I'm so sorry. I don't know how this happened. I should go. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. We've been cleared for takeoff. Please take your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Our flight time to Barbados will be approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes. Grace's eyes widened in panic. Wait, we're taking off? I need to get off this plane. This is all a mistake. The flight attendant, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward. I'm sorry, but we've already pulled away from the gate. Federal regulations prohibit anyone from leaving the aircraft once we've begun taxi procedures. Alexander watched as Grace's face cycled through emotions, panic, embarrassment, and something that looked like defeat. She sank into the seat across from him, her hands shaking slightly as she fumbled with her seatbelt. Hey, he said gently, leaning forward. It's okay. We'll figure this out. Grace looked up at him, and he was struck by the warmth in her brown eyes despite her obvious distress. I can't afford to pay for this flight. I don't even know what something like this costs, but I know I can't afford it. Don't worry about that, Alexander said without thinking. Seriously. Whatever happened, we'll sort it out when we land. Grace stared at him. You don't even know me. Why would you? Because you look like you're about to cry, and I have a feeling you don't cry easily. He settled back into his seat as the plane began its taxi toward the runway. I'm Alexander, by the way. My friends call me Alex. Grace, she replied, managing a small smile. And you're right, I don't cry easily. I'm a nurse. We're trained to handle crises. A nurse, Alex repeated, genuinely interested. Where do you work? Northwestern Memorial in Chicago. I see you mostly, but I float to other departments when they need coverage. Grace found herself relaxing slightly despite the surreal situation. What kind of business are you in? Real estate and tech, mostly. I'm acquiring a resort chain in Barbados. Alex paused, studying her face. Can I ask you something? How did you end up with boarding credentials for my private jet? Grace pulled out the letter she'd received, handing it to him. "I got this yesterday. I thought it was legitimate." Alex read the letter carefully, his expression growing more puzzled. "This is very detailed. Professional letterhead, proper formatting. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make this look official. You think someone played an elaborate prank on me?" Grace's voice was small. "I don't know what to think." Alex handed the letter back. "But I'll tell you this, whoever did this, they picked the right person to mistake for my assistant." "What do you mean?" Alex gestured to the opulent interior of the jet. "Most people would be taking pictures, posting on social media, asking about the cost of everything. You're sitting there worried about paying for something that isn't even your fault." Grace looked around the cabin as if seeing it for the first time. "It is beautiful. I've never been on a private jet before. I've never been on any kind of jet before, actually. The flight from Chicago was my first time on a plane." "Your first time flying?" Alex's voice held a note of surprise. "Hard to believe, right? 28 years old and I've never left the Midwest. Between work and helping my family." Grace trailed off, realizing she was probably oversharing with a stranger. "Tell me about your family," Alex said, and Grace was surprised by the genuine interest in his voice. "It's just me, my mom, and my younger sister. My dad died when I was 19, and I've been helping support them ever since. My sister's in college, pre-med, actually. She's going to be a doctor." Grace's face lit up when she talked about her sister. "She's brilliant. Much smarter than me." "I doubt that," Alex said quietly. "It takes a special kind of intelligence to spend your days taking care of other people." Grace felt a flutter in her chest at his words. "What about you? Do you have family?" Alex's expression grew more guarded. "My parents are still alive, but we don't talk much. My sister." He paused, looking out the window at the clouds below. "She died in a car accident 10 years ago." "I'm sorry," Grace said, and Alex was struck by how much genuine sympathy she managed to convey in just 2 words. "She would have liked you," Alex said suddenly. "Rebecca was always drawn to people who put others first. She used to say that the world was full of people trying to get ahead, but the real heroes were the ones who helped others do the same." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "She sounds wonderful." She was. She kept me grounded, you know? Reminded me that money wasn't everything." Alex laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I haven't been very good at remembering that lesson on my own." The flight attendant approached with a tray of food. "Would you care for lunch? We have grilled salmon or chicken marsala." Grace's stomach growled audibly, and she blushed. "I'm sorry, I haven't eaten since yesterday. But I should probably just have water." "She'll have the salmon," Alex interrupted. "And I'll have the chicken." "Thank you, Janet." "You don't have to," Grace began. "Grace," Alex said firmly. "You're stuck on this plane with me for the next 4 hours. The least I can do is feed you." As they ate, the conversation flowed more naturally. Grace told him about her patients, about Mrs. Henderson's advice to live her own life, about her dreams of maybe one day traveling to see the world. Alex found himself talking about things he hadn't discussed in years: his loneliness, his struggle to find meaning in his success, his sister's memory. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said as they finished eating. "Why do you do it? The business, the deals, all of it?" Alex was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, I don't know anymore. It started as a way to honor my family's legacy, but somewhere along the way, it became this machine. I make money to make more money. I acquire companies to acquire more companies. I'm not sure I even enjoy it anymore. So why not stop? Stop? Alex looked at her as if she'd suggested he sprout wings and fly. I can't just stop. I have responsibilities, employees, investors. But what do you want? Grace pressed. Not what you're supposed to want, not what's expected of you. What do you actually want? Alex stared at her, and Grace felt the weight of his gaze. No one had asked him that question in years. Maybe no one had ever asked him that question. I want to matter, he said finally. I want to make a difference that isn't measured in dollars and cents. I want to connect with people without wondering what they want from me. I want to laugh again. Really laugh. When was the last time you laughed? Really laughed? Alex thought about it. I honestly can't remember. Grace smiled, and Alex felt something shift in his chest. Well, we've got 3 hours left on this flight. Maybe we can work on that. And somehow, impossibly, they did. Grace told him stories from the hospital, not the sad ones, but the funny ones. The patient who tried to escape wearing only a hospital gown and made it all the way to the parking garage. The time she accidentally walked into the wrong room and spent 10 minutes taking vital signs on a man who kept insisting he was fine because he was just visiting his wife. Alex found himself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in months. In return, he shared stories from his early days in business, when he'd been young and hungry and made mistakes that seemed catastrophic at the time but were hilarious in retrospect. I once showed up to a $1 million pitch meeting with my shirt buttoned wrong, he admitted. I was so nervous I'd gotten dressed in the dark. Sat through the entire presentation looking like a 5-year-old who dressed himself. Did you get the deal? Actually, yes. The CEO said anyone confident enough to show up looking like that had to be worth listening to. Grace laughed, and the sound filled the cabin with warmth. See? You do know how to laugh. As the plane began its descent toward Barbados, both Grace and Alex felt a strange reluctance for the flight to end. Something had shifted between them during those 4 hours, a connection that neither had expected and both were afraid to name. What happens when we land? Grace asked, looking out the window at the approaching island. I don't know, Alex admitted. But I know I don't want this to end. Grace met his eyes, and in that moment, both of them understood that their lives had just changed forever. The mistake that had brought them together was beginning to feel less like an error and more like fate. The plane touched down on the runway of Grantley Adams International Airport, and as the wheels kissed the tarmac, Grace Patterson and Alexander Kane looked at each other with the recognition that they were no longer the same people who had boarded this plane in New York. The Caribbean sun was waiting for them, but more importantly, so was the rest of their story. The humid Caribbean air hit Grace like a warm embrace as she stepped off the plane, but the reality of her situation crashed over her like a cold wave. The golden hour sunlight painted everything in shades of amber and coral, and palm trees swayed in the distance beyond the private aviation terminal, but all Grace could think about was how spectacularly she'd messed up her life in the span of 4 hours. This is insane, she whispered to herself, clutching her small purse as Alexander spoke to a customs official in rapid, confident tones. Even here, even in this moment of chaos, he commanded respect. People looked at him and saw power, success, someone who belonged in places like this. Grace looked down at her burgundy sweater dress, which now felt completely inappropriate for the tropical climate, and realized she belonged in a hospital in Chicago, not on a private runway in Barbados with a man who probably owned half the island. Grace? Alexander approached her, his suit jacket now draped over his arm, his white dress shirt rolled up at the sleeves. The slight dishevelment somehow made him even more attractive, which only added to Grace's growing panic. "The customs officer needs to see your passport." "Right, of course." Grace fumbled in her purse, her hands shaking slightly. She'd gotten her passport 3 years ago for a medical mission trip to Guatemala that she'd ultimately had to cancel when her mother got sick. This was its first use, and she felt like a fraud. The customs officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a melodic Barbadian accent, looked between Grace's passport and her face. "First time in Barbados, Ms. Patterson?" "Yes, ma'am." "Actually, first time anywhere outside the United States." "Well, welcome to paradise. You picked a beautiful time to visit. Any special occasion?" Grace glanced at Alexander, who was watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. "It's complicated." After clearing customs, they walked through the terminal in awkward silence. Grace noticed how other passengers and airport staff looked at Alexander, some with recognition, others with the subtle deference reserved for obvious wealth and power. She felt like an imposter walking beside him. "My driver should be waiting," Alexander said, checking his phone. "I'll have him drop you at your hotel first." "My hotel?" Grace stopped walking. "Alex, I don't have a hotel. I don't have anything. I thought I was on a medical transport that included accommodations. I have maybe $40 in cash and a credit card that's probably maxed out." Alexander turned to face her fully, and Grace saw something flicker across his features: concern, guilt, and something else she couldn't identify. "Grace, you're not going to pay for anything. This whole situation is—" "Don't," Grace said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Don't you dare say this is your fault. And don't you dare try to pay for everything like I'm some charity case. That's not what I—" "Isn't it?" Grace felt 8 years of exhaustion and frustration bubbling to the surface. "I'm a nurse from Chicago who accidentally got on your private jet. You're a billionaire who probably has assistants to handle inconveniences like me. Just call your people, arrange for me to fly home, and we can pretend this never happened." Alexander stared at her, clearly taken aback by her outburst. "Is that what you want? To pretend this never happened?" Grace looked at him, really looked at him. During the flight, she'd begun to see past the expensive clothes and polished exterior to the lonely man underneath. But now, standing in this airport where he clearly belonged and she clearly didn't, the differences between them felt insurmountable. "I want to go back to my real life," she said quietly. "This isn't me, Alex. I don't belong in private jets and tropical islands. I belong in a hospital, taking care of people who actually need me. What if I need you?" The words hung in the air between them, and Grace felt her breath catch. But before she could respond, a voice called out across the terminal. "Mr. Kane! Mr. Kane, there you are." They turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching them with brisk efficiency. She wore a crisp white blouse and navy slacks, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried herself with the air of someone accustomed to solving problems. "Margaret?" Alexander looked genuinely surprised. "What are you doing here? You were supposed to stay in New York." Margaret Wilson, Alexander's assistant for the past 6 years, came to a stop in front of them, slightly out of breath. "Mr. Kane, we have a problem." The Meridian Group moved up their timeline. They want to finalize the resort acquisition tomorrow morning instead of next week. I flew down as soon as I got word. Grace felt her heart sink. Of course. Reality was reasserting itself. Alexander had important business to attend to, billion-dollar deals to close. She was just an inconvenience, a hiccup in his schedule. Margaret's gaze shifted to Grace, and her eyebrows rose slightly. And you must be the medical consultant we discussed for the resort's wellness center. Medical consultant? Grace looked between Margaret and Alexander in confusion. Alexander opened his mouth to correct Margaret, but something in Grace's expression stopped him. She looked like she was preparing to run, to disappear back into the life she came from, and suddenly he couldn't bear the thought of letting her go. "Yes," he said slowly. "This is Grace Patterson. She's here to assess the wellness facilities at the Meridian Resort chain." Grace's eyes widened, but before she could protest, Margaret was extending her hand with a professional smile. "Wonderful to meet you, Dr. Patterson. I have you both booked at the Ocean View Resort for tonight, and I've arranged for a car to take you there. Mr. Kane, your meeting with the Meridian Group is scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow at their flagship property." "Dr. Patterson?" Grace finally found her voice. "I'm not a doctor, I'm a nurse practitioner," Alexander interrupted smoothly. "With extensive experience in acute care and patient wellness." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Perfect. The Meridian Group has been looking to expand their medical tourism offerings. Your expertise will be invaluable." As Margaret continued talking about schedules and logistics, Grace felt like she was drowning. Everything was happening too fast, spinning too far out of control. She touched Alexander's arm, and he leaned down so she could whisper in his ear. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "Buying us time," he whispered back. "Just go with it. Please." "Mr. Kane?" Margaret was looking at them expectantly. "Shall we head to the resort? You'll want to review the acquisition documents tonight." "Of course," Alexander said, straightening. "Grace, shall we?" The ride to the Ocean View Resort should have been magical. The road wound along the coastline, offering breathtaking views of crystal-clear water and powder-white beaches. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and the warm breeze through the car windows carried the scent of salt water and tropical flowers. But Grace spent the entire drive staring out the window in panic. What was she doing? She was lying to Alexander's assistant, pretending to be qualified for something she wasn't, and worst of all, she was starting to hope that maybe, somehow, this could all work out. Alexander sat beside her in the back seat, ostensibly reviewing documents on his tablet, but she could feel his eyes on her every few minutes. Margaret sat in the front passenger seat, efficiently making phone calls and confirming appointments, treating Grace like she actually belonged in this world. "The Ocean View Resort is beautiful," Margaret said over her shoulder as they turned into a palm-lined driveway. "It's actually one of the properties in the Meridian chain that Mr. Kane is acquiring. You'll have a chance to see it from both a guest and consultant perspective." Grace's mouth fell open as the resort came into view. It was like something from a postcard, white stone buildings with red tile roofs nestled among lush tropical gardens, multiple pools sparkling under string lights, and beyond it all, the endless expanse of the Caribbean Sea. "It's gorgeous," Grace breathed, forgetting for a moment to be anxious. "Wait until you see it in the morning," Alexander said softly. "The sunrise here is incredible." Margaret arranged their check-in with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. Grace found herself holding a key card to an oceanfront suite that probably cost more per night than she made in a week. "Your rooms are adjacent," Margaret informed them. "Mr. Kane, I've arranged for the acquisition documents to be delivered to your suite within the hour. Dr. Patterson, I've taken the liberty of scheduling a spa treatment for you this evening. I thought you might want to relax after your journey." That's very thoughtful, but I couldn't, Grace began. It's on the company account, Margaret said briskly. Consider it a business expense. You'll want to be refreshed for tomorrow's property tour. As Margaret headed to her own room, Grace and Alexander found themselves alone in the elegant lobby, surrounded by the sounds of soft music and distant waves. Alex, Grace said quietly, this has to stop. I can't keep pretending to be someone I'm not. You're not pretending to be someone you're not, Alexander said. You're just letting yourself be someone you could be. I'm a nurse from Chicago. I don't know anything about medical tourism or resort consulting or any of this. You know about patient care. You know about healing and helping people feel better. That's exactly what medical tourism is about. Grace shook her head. You don't understand. When this falls apart, and it will fall apart, you'll be embarrassed. Your business deal could be compromised. I could ruin everything for you. Alexander stepped closer, and Grace felt her pulse quicken. Grace, in the past 10 hours, you've reminded me what it feels like to laugh. You've made me think about what I actually want instead of what I'm supposed to want. You've made me remember that there are people in the world who care more about helping others than helping themselves. You couldn't ruin anything for me. You've already saved me. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. You don't really know me. If you knew how many mistakes I've made, how many times I've failed. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone fails sometimes. But not everyone gets back up and keeps helping people anyway. Grace looked around the luxurious lobby, at the other guests in their expensive clothes and casual confidence, at the life that was so far beyond anything she'd ever imagined for herself. I don't belong here, she whispered. Maybe not, Alexander said gently. But you belong somewhere good. You deserve good things, Grace. You deserve to be treated like you matter. Grace met his eyes, and for a moment, she almost believed him. Almost let herself imagine that maybe she could have this, even if it was just for one night. But then reality crashed back over her. Tomorrow morning, Alexander would have his important business meeting. Margaret would expect her to provide professional insights she didn't have. The whole elaborate charade would crumble, and Grace would be left feeling more foolish and out of place than ever. I need to go to my room, she said abruptly. I need to think. Alexander watched her walk away, her small suitcase bumping behind her, her shoulders set with determined resignation. He knew that look. It was the look of someone preparing to run, and he was powerless to stop her. In her oceanfront suite, Grace stood at the window overlooking the moonlit beach and tried to figure out how her life had become so complicated in the span of 12 hours. The room was beautiful, elegant but comfortable, with a four-poster bed draped in gauzy white curtains and French doors that opened onto a private balcony. She pulled out her phone and called Kelly. Grace! Oh my God, how's the medical conference? Please tell me you're having an amazing time. Grace almost laughed at the irony. Kelly, I think I've made a terrible mistake. She told Kelly everything, the private jet, Alexander, the mistaken identity, the lie about being a medical consultant. Kelly listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of amazement. Let me get this straight, Kelly said when Grace finished. You accidentally got on a private jet with a gorgeous billionaire, flew to a tropical paradise, and he's treating you like you're the most important person in the world, and you think this is a mistake? It's not real, Kelly. It's all based on a lie. What lie? That you care about patients? That you know about healthcare? That you're smart and capable and deserving of good things? Grace was quiet for a long moment. I don't know how to be the person he thinks I am. Maybe you don't have to know. Maybe you just have to be willing to try. After hanging up with Kelly, Grace sat on the balcony, listening to the waves and trying to sort through her emotions. Part of her wanted to run, to book a flight home and pretend this had all been a dream. But another part, the part that had been stirring to life during their conversation on the plane, wanted to stay and see what might happen. She thought about Mrs. Henderson's words, "Don't forget to live your own life while you're busy saving everyone else's." Maybe this was what living her own life looked like. Maybe it was messy and scary and uncertain, but maybe that was okay. Grace picked up the phone and dialed the spa. "Hi, this is Grace Patterson in the oceanfront suite. I understand there's a treatment reserved for me." 3 hours later, after a massage that melted away 8 years of tension and a facial that made her skin glow, Grace felt more relaxed than she had in months. But she also felt more conflicted than ever. As she prepared for bed, she heard a soft knock at her door. She opened it to find Alexander, now dressed in khaki pants and a white linen shirt, looking uncertain and hopeful. "I thought you might like to see the beach at night," he said. "If you're not too tired." Grace looked at him, then at the moonlit ocean beyond her balcony. Tomorrow, she would have to face reality. Tomorrow, she would probably have to go home. But tonight, she was in paradise with a man who made her feel like she mattered. "Give me 5 minutes to change," she said. As Grace closed the door to get ready, Alexander smiled for the first time since they'd landed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, he had a chance to show Grace Patterson that she deserved all the beauty the world had to offer. Sometimes the biggest risk is letting ourselves believe we deserve happiness. Let me know what you think Grace should do in the comments below. The resistance was crumbling, but neither Grace nor Alexander knew yet whether that would lead to something beautiful or something that would break both their hearts. Grace changed into a flowing lavender sundress, the only casual dress she'd packed, thinking she might need it for the medical conference's welcome dinner. The soft fabric felt foreign against her skin after years of scrubs and practical clothing. She'd let her hair down from its usual neat bun, and it fell in gentle waves around her shoulders. Looking at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back, relaxed, glowing from the spa treatment, and for the first time in years, beautiful. Alexander was waiting by the pool area when she emerged, and the way his breath caught when he saw her made Grace's stomach flutter with nervous butterflies. The moonlight caught the highlights in her dark hair, and the ocean breeze made her dress dance around her legs. "You look..." Alexander began, then stopped himself. "I was going to say beautiful, but that seems inadequate." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you. You look pretty good yourself." The linen shirt made his green eyes seem deeper, and without the formal business attire, he looked younger, more approachable. More real. They walked down a winding path lit by subtle landscape lighting, the sound of their footsteps mixing with the distant music from the resort's beachside bar and the gentle crash of waves. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and salt water. "I've never walked on a beach at night," Grace admitted as they reached the sand. She slipped off her sandals, letting her toes sink into the cool grains. "Never?" Alexander seemed genuinely surprised as he removed his own shoes. Growing up in inner-city Chicago, the closest thing to a beach was Lake Michigan, and trust me, it's not quite the same as this. Grace gestured toward the endless expanse of dark water stretching to the horizon, where stars reflected like scattered diamonds. They walked along the water's edge, the gentle waves lapping at their feet. Grace couldn't help but laugh when a slightly larger wave caught her off guard, soaking the hem of her dress. "Careful," Alexander said, reaching out instinctively to steady her. His hand found hers, warm and strong, and Grace felt an electric current run up her arm. She should have pulled away. Should have maintained the professional distance that would make leaving easier. Instead, she found herself intertwining their fingers. "Alex," she said softly, "can I ask you something personal? After the day we've had, I think we're past worrying about what's too personal." Grace smiled at that. "Why aren't you married?" "I mean, you're successful, attractive, charming when you want to be. There must be women lining up." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, watching the moonlight dance on the water. "There have been women. Lots of them, actually. But they all wanted the same thing, the lifestyle, the status, the money. None of them ever seemed interested in just me. That must be lonely. Incredibly lonely. What about you? Ever been close to getting married?" Grace laughed, but there was a note of sadness in it. "There was someone. A doctor at the hospital. Marcus. We dated for 2 years, and I thought we had a future together. What happened? He got offered a position at Johns Hopkins. Amazing opportunity, everything he'd worked for. When he asked me to come with him, I said yes immediately. I was ready to leave everything behind for him." Alexander felt a pang of something that might have been jealousy. "But you didn't go. 3 days before we were supposed to leave, my mother had a heart attack. She needed surgery, ongoing care, and the medical bills were overwhelming. Marcus said he understood, that he'd wait, that we'd figure it out together." They stopped walking, and Grace turned to face the ocean, her free hand wrapping around her waist protectively. "He lasted 6 weeks. Then he called and said he'd met someone else, someone who could prioritize their relationship. Someone who didn't have complications. Grace, I'm sorry." It's okay," Grace said quickly. "I mean, it hurt at the time, but now I realize we wanted different things. He wanted someone who could fit seamlessly into his life. I needed someone who understood that my life comes with responsibilities, with people who depend on me." Alexander squeezed her hand gently. "His loss." Grace looked at him sideways. "You don't even know me well enough to say that. I know you gave up your dream job to take care of your mother. I know you work 14-hour shifts and still worry about your patients when you go home. I know you apologize for taking up space and never ask for anything for yourself. I know that in one conversation, you made me remember what it feels like to want something more than money and success." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "You're idealizing me, Alex. I'm not some saint. I'm tired and stressed, and sometimes I resent the sacrifices I've made. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd just put myself first for once. That doesn't make you selfish, Grace. It makes you human." They found a piece of driftwood and sat down, their feet still in the sand, the waves continuing their eternal rhythm a few yards away. The resort's lights twinkled behind them, but they felt completely alone in their own little world. "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" Alexander asked. Grace nodded, sensing the shift to something deeper. "Sometimes I lie awake at night and wonder if my parents and Rebecca would be proud of the man I've become, or if they'd be disappointed that I let success replace everything else in my life. What do you think they'd say?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "Rebecca would probably tell me to stop being an idiot and go find something that makes me happy. She was always the practical one, even when we were kids. She sounds wonderful." She was. She used to say that money was just a tool, and if you weren't using it to build something meaningful, you were wasting it. Alexander picked up a handful of sand, letting it run through his fingers. I think she'd like you. Based on one day? Based on the fact that you see people for who they are, not what they can do for you. Rebecca valued authenticity above everything else. Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest at the thought that this man's beloved sister might have approved of her. It was dangerous, this feeling of belonging somewhere she didn't belong. Alex, what happens tomorrow? When Margaret expects me to provide professional insights about medical tourism? When your business associates realize I'm not who you said I was? Alexander turned to face her fully. We'll figure it out. Together. You can't just wing $1 billion business deal. Watch me, Alexander said, and there was something in his voice, a recklessness, a willingness to risk everything, that both thrilled and terrified Grace. Why would you do that? Why would you risk your business for someone you just met? Alexander reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Because in one day, you've reminded me of everything I've been missing. Because when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be excited about tomorrow instead of just getting through it. Grace felt her breath catch. Alex, I know this is crazy. I know we barely know each other. But I also know that I've never felt more like myself than I have today, and that's because of you. Grace looked into his eyes and saw sincerity there, vulnerability, hope. She also saw the same fear she was feeling, the fear of wanting something that seemed impossible. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I, Alexander admitted. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the best things are supposed to be a little scary. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands intertwined, listening to the ocean and the distant sounds of the resort. Grace felt like she was in a dream, one she was terrified of waking up from. There's something else, Alexander said eventually. Something I should probably tell you. Grace felt her stomach drop. What? The Meridian Group, the company I'm acquiring, they've been struggling financially partly because their wellness programs aren't meeting guest expectations. They've been looking for someone with real healthcare experience to help them redesign their approach. Alex, what are you saying? I'm saying that maybe this isn't as much of a coincidence as we thought. Maybe you're exactly what they need, and they're exactly what you need. Grace stood up abruptly, sand falling from her dress. You're talking about offering me a job? Alex, I live in Chicago. I have responsibilities, commitments, a life. I know. I'm not asking you to give up your life. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe your life could be bigger than you thought. This is moving too fast, Grace said, beginning to pace along the water's edge. 12 hours ago, I didn't even know you existed. Now you're talking about business opportunities and whatever this is between us. Alexander stood as well, but he didn't chase after her. You're right. It is moving fast. But Grace, what if fast is exactly what we need? What if we've both been moving so slowly, so carefully, that we've forgotten how to actually live? Grace stopped pacing and looked at him. In the moonlight, with his hair slightly messed by the ocean breeze and his shirt wrinkled from sitting in the sand, he looked nothing like the intimidating billionaire she'd met on the plane. He looked like a man who was just as lost and hopeful as she was. What are you really asking me, Alex? I'm asking you to stay. Not forever, not with any promises about what happens next, but just for tomorrow. Let me show you the resort. Let me introduce you to the Meridian Group. Let's see what possibilities exist that we haven't imagined yet. Grace felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Every rational part of her brain was screaming that this was insane, that she should get on the next flight home before she got in any deeper. But there was another voice, quieter but growing stronger, that whispered maybe this was exactly what she'd been waiting for her entire life. "If I stay," Grace said slowly, "and if I meet with your business associates, I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not. I'll tell them exactly who I am and what my experience is. No more lies." "Deal," Alexander said immediately. "And if this all falls apart tomorrow, if your business deal is compromised because of me, you can't blame me for that." "I won't. I promise." Grace looked out at the ocean, at the endless possibilities stretching beyond the horizon. "I've spent my entire adult life playing it safe, making responsible choices, putting everyone else's needs first. And what has that gotten you?" Grace thought about her tiny apartment, her exhausting job, her empty bank account, her non-existent social life. "A lot of tired," she admitted. "So maybe it's time to try something different." Grace turned back to Alexander, and in that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. "Okay. Okay? I'll stay tomorrow. I'll meet your business associates. I'll see what happens." Grace paused, then added with a small smile, "But I'm keeping my return flight for Monday, just in case." Alexander's face broke into a grin that transformed his entire appearance. "Fair enough." As they walked back toward the resort, Grace felt like she was floating. Maybe it was the tropical air, or the moonlight, or the feeling of sand between her toes, but for the first time in years, she felt genuinely excited about tomorrow. "Alex," she said as they reached the pool area. "Yeah? Thank you. For making me feel like I'm worth taking a chance on." Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her. "Grace, you're worth taking every chance on." The moment hung between them, charged with possibility and the promise of something neither of them had expected to find. Grace felt herself leaning slightly toward him, and she saw him respond, the space between them shrinking until... "Mr. Kane! There you are!" Margaret's voice cut through the night air like a blade, and they sprang apart guiltily. Margaret approached them with her usual brisk efficiency, though Grace thought she caught a flicker of something, surprise? Disapproval, in the older woman's expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly sorry, "but I've just received word from the Meridian Group. They'd like to move the meeting even earlier, 8 a.m. instead of 9. Apparently, they have another potential buyer flying in later in the day." Grace felt her stomach drop. Another buyer meant competition, pressure, higher stakes. It made her presence seem even more ridiculous and potentially damaging. "That's fine," Alexander said smoothly. "We'll be ready." Margaret's gaze shifted to Grace. "Dr. Patterson, I took the liberty of having some materials about the Meridian Group's current wellness programs sent to your room. You might want to review them tonight so you're prepared for tomorrow's discussion." "Of course," Grace managed, though the word came out slightly strangled. "Excellent. I'll see you both at 7:30 a.m. in the lobby." Margaret turned to go, then paused. "Oh, and Dr. Patterson? The Meridian Group's CEO will be particularly interested in your thoughts on integrating traditional nursing care with luxury hospitality. They've been struggling with that balance." After Margaret disappeared back into the resort, Grace and Alexander stood in silence for a moment. "Well," Grace said finally, "I guess there's no backing out now. Are you having second thoughts?" Grace considered the question seriously. "Honestly, I'm terrified. But I'm also more excited than I've been in years." "Is that completely insane?" "If it is, then we're both insane," Alexander said. "And you know what? I'm okay with that." They walked to the elevator together, the weight of tomorrow's meeting settling over them both. When they reached Grace's floor, Alexander walked her to her door. "Grace," he said as she slid her key card. "Yeah? Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm glad you got on my plane." Grace smiled, and Alexander felt his heart skip a beat. "Ask me again tomorrow night if you still feel that way." As Grace disappeared into her room, Alexander stood in the hallway for a long moment, already counting the hours until he'd see her again. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to a business meeting, not for the deal, but for the woman who would be sitting beside him. In her room, Grace found the Meridian Group materials Margaret had mentioned. As she flipped through reports about guest satisfaction, medical tourism trends, and wellness program statistics, she realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She actually had opinions about this stuff. Ideas. Solutions. Maybe she wasn't as out of her depth as she thought. Grace fell asleep that night with the sound of waves outside her window and the warmth of possibility in her heart. Tomorrow would test everything, their connection, her courage, and whether a nurse from Chicago really could find her place in a billionaire's world. But for tonight, anything seemed possible. Grace stood in front of the bathroom mirror in her hotel room, adjusting the emerald green blazer she'd borrowed from the resort's boutique that morning. Alexander had quietly arranged for a selection of professional attire to be delivered to her room at dawn, along with a note that simply read, "You've got this." The blazer fit perfectly over her cream-colored blouse, and she'd paired it with black slacks and her most comfortable low heels. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, and she wore the small pearl earrings her grandmother had left her. Looking at herself, she almost believed she belonged in a boardroom with billionaires. Almost. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the Meridian Group materials she'd studied until 2 a.m. She'd filled 3 pages with notes, ideas about how to bridge the gap between luxury hospitality and genuine healthcare. The concepts had flowed out of her naturally, as if she'd been waiting years to think about something other than just surviving. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Alexander, immaculate in a navy blue suit with a silver tie, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression that was equal parts confidence and concern. "Good morning," he said, offering her one of the cups. "I thought you might need this." "Thank you." Grace accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that it was prepared exactly how she'd had it yesterday, cream, no sugar. He'd been paying attention. "How are you feeling about today?" "Honestly, more nervous than I've been about a business meeting in 10 years. Alexander stepped into her room, and Grace closed the door behind him. "But it's a good nervous. Like the kind you get before something important happens." Grace took a sip of coffee and felt some of her anxiety settle. "Alexander, before we go downstairs, I need to know something. If this goes badly, if I embarrass you or damage your deal, will you regret bringing me?" Alexander set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "Grace, the answer is no. No matter what happens in that conference room, meeting you has already changed my life. The deal is just business. This is everything." The sincerity in his voice made Grace's heart flutter, but also intensified her nerves. She had so much to lose now, so much more than just her pride. "There's something I didn't tell you last night," Grace said, setting down her own cup. "About why I really left Chicago." Alexander waited, sensing the importance of whatever she was about to share. "My mother didn't just have a heart attack. She had it because she'd been skipping her medication to help pay for my sister's college tuition. She'd been working 2 jobs, barely sleeping, barely eating, also Jasmine could study pre-med at Northwestern." Grace moved to the window, looking out at the ocean that seemed impossibly blue in the morning light. When Marcus left, when I realized I was going to be handling everything alone, I felt like I was drowning. The medical bills, my mother's ongoing care, Jasmine's tuition, rent, groceries, everything was on my shoulders. Grace, you don't have to. I do. I need you to understand who you're really in business with today. Grace turned back to him, her brown eyes bright with unshed tears. 3 months ago, I started picking up extra shifts in the ER, working sometimes 18 hours a day. I was running on caffeine and determination, barely functioning. Alexander felt his chest tighten, imagining Grace pushing herself to the breaking point. One night, I was so tired I almost gave a patient the wrong medication. Almost. Mrs. Chen caught my mistake before anything happened, but I realized I was becoming exactly the kind of nurse I'd sworn never to be, too exhausted to be safe, too overwhelmed to provide real care. What did you do? Grace laughed, but there was pain in it. I cried in a supply closet for 20 minutes, then I went home and looked at my life. Really looked at it. I was 28 years old, working myself to death, and for what? To barely stay afloat? To never have a single day that was just mine? She walked over to her purse and pulled out a worn piece of paper. This is the real reason I entered that medical conference contest. It wasn't about education or career advancement. Alexander took the paper and read it, a printed email confirmation for the contest entry. But it wasn't for the St. Vincent Medical Conference. It was for a wellness retreat in California, one specifically designed for healthcare workers experiencing burnout. I was going to quit nursing, Grace said quietly. I was going to take that retreat, then come home and find a different career. Something that would pay better and let me have a life. I'd already applied to work at a pharmaceutical company in their patient advocacy department. Alexander looked up from the paper, his expression intense. Grace. I was done. Done sacrificing everything, done being everyone's solution, done pretending that being selfless was the same as being happy. Grace sat down on the edge of the bed. And then I got on her plane by mistake, and for the first time in years, I remembered what it felt like to want something for myself. Alexander sat beside her, careful to maintain some distance but close enough that she could feel his support. What do you want now? I want to stay in nursing, but I want it to matter. I want to help people in a way that doesn't destroy me in the process. I want to wake up excited about my day instead of dreading it. Grace looked at him sideways. And I want to see where this goes, whatever this is between us. Even though it scares you? Especially because it scares me. I've been playing it safe for so long that I've forgotten what it felt like to want something enough to risk everything for it. Alexander reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. Grace, what I'm about to tell you might change how you feel about this whole situation. Grace felt her stomach drop. What do you mean? The Meridian Group isn't just struggling with their wellness programs. They're struggling because their previous healthcare consultant embezzled nearly $2 million from their medical tourism program. They've been looking for someone with impeccable credentials and references to help them rebuild trust with their clientele. Alexander, what are you saying? I'm saying that Margaret didn't just find materials about their wellness programs for you to review. She spent half the night running a background check on you, verifying your nursing credentials, checking your employment history, even calling Northwestern Memorial to speak with your supervisors. Grace stood up abruptly. She what? Grace, sit down. Please. Alexander's voice was gentle but urgent. Everything checked out. More than checked out. Your supervisor, Nancy, apparently spent 15 minutes telling Margaret that you're the most dedicated, compassionate, and competent nurse she's ever worked with. She said losing you would be like losing the heart of their entire department. Grace felt dizzy. I don't understand. Why would Margaret? Because after spending yesterday with you, I realized you weren't just perfect for this situation by accident. You're perfect for it because you're exactly what the Meridian Group needs. Alexander stood as well, moving closer to her. Someone with real healthcare experience, unquestionable integrity, and the kind of compassion that can't be faked or bought. You investigated me, Grace said, and Alexander could hear the hurt in her voice. Margaret investigated you. At my request. But Grace, I need you to understand why. Grace crossed her arms, putting up a defensive barrier. I'm listening. Because I was falling for you, and I needed to know if there was any possible way this could be real. If there was any chance that what felt like fate might actually be fate. Grace felt tears prick her eyes again, but she wasn't sure if they were from hurt or hope. And what did you decide? I decided that either the universe has an incredible sense of humor, or we were meant to find each other. Alexander stepped closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Grace, the Meridian Group wants to offer you a position as their Director of Wellness and Medical Services. The salary is more than double what you make in Chicago, plus benefits, plus a housing allowance, plus the opportunity to design a program from the ground up. Grace stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. That's impossible. It's not only possible, it's what they've been searching for. And Grace, there's more. More? Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a tablet. The position would be based primarily in Barbados, but you'd also oversee their wellness programs at resorts in the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Costa Rica. You'd travel, work with international medical professionals, and help design the future of luxury medical tourism. Grace took the tablet with shaking hands and scrolled through what appeared to be a formal job offer. The salary figure made her gasp audibly. It was more money than she'd ever imagined making. This is a real offer, she whispered. Completely real. They want to meet with you this morning not to pretend you're my medical consultant, but to interview you for a position they've been trying to fill for 8 months. Grace set the tablet down and walked to the window again, her mind reeling. Alexander, this is too much. It's too convenient, too perfect. Things like this don't happen to people like me. What do you mean, people like you? Grace turned back to him, and Alexander saw all her insecurities, all her years of believing she wasn't worth investing in, written across her face. People from the projects in Chicago. People who work 3 jobs just to keep their heads above water. People who wear scrubs to work instead of designer suits. People whose biggest dream was maybe someday having a savings account with more than $50 in it. Alexander felt his heart break a little at the pain in her voice. Grace, where you come from doesn't determine where you can go. Doesn't it? Alex, yesterday I was excited about the possibility of affording groceries for the whole month. Now you're talking about 6-figure salaries and international travel. It feels like a fairy tale, and fairy tales don't happen to girls like me. Alexander moved to stand in front of her, gently taking her hands in his. Grace, can I tell you something about fairy tales? She nodded, not trusting her voice. They're not about perfect princesses who have everything handed to them. They're about ordinary people who face impossible odds and choose to believe in something better. They're about people who work hard, sacrifice for others, and never give up hope even when everything seems stacked against them. Grace felt tears spilling over now. Alex, you've been living a fairy tale your entire life. Working multiple jobs to put your sister through college, caring for your mother, dedicating your life to helping others heal. That's not ordinary, Grace. That's heroic. I don't feel heroic. I feel tired and scared and like I'm in way over my head. Then you're exactly where you need to be, Alexander said softly. Because the best things in life happen when we're brave enough to be in over our heads. Grace looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and hope. What if I take this job and I'm terrible at it? What if I can't handle the pressure or the responsibility? Then you'll figure it out, because that's what you do. You adapt, you learn, you find a way to make things work. Alexander squeezed her hands. Grace, you've been managing impossible situations your entire life. This isn't different, it's just better compensated. Grace laughed despite her tears. You make it sound so simple. Maybe it is. Maybe we've been making it complicated because we're scared to believe we deserve good things. Grace studied his face, seeing her own fears and hopes reflected there. What about us? If I take this job, if I move here, what happens between us? I don't know, Alexander admitted. But I know I want to find out. I know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. And I know that I'd rather take this chance with you than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Grace felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for years finally opening. I'm terrified. So am I. But maybe that's how we know it's worth it. Grace took a deep breath, thinking about Mrs. Henderson's words about not forgetting to live her own life. Thinking about her mother's sacrifices and her sister's dreams. Thinking about the 8 years she'd spent playing it safe and where it had gotten her. Okay, she said quietly. Okay? I'll do the interview. I'll see what they have to say. I'll consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I'm worth taking a chance on. Alexander's face broke into a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. Grace, you're worth every chance in the world. The biggest risk, they say, is not taking the risk at all. What do you think Grace should do? Let me know in the comments. Grace took one last look in the mirror, straightened her shoulders, and made a decision that would change the course of her entire life. She was going to walk into that conference room and show them exactly what a nurse from Chicago could do. But first, she had one more question for Alexander. If this all works out, if I get this job and we explore whatever this is between us, promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll never make me feel like I should be grateful for your attention. Promise me this will be a partnership between equals, not charity from someone who has everything to someone who has nothing. Alexander looked at her with an expression of such respect and admiration that Grace felt her breath catch. Grace Patterson, he said solemnly, I promise you that from this moment forward, you will never be anything less than my equal. In business, in life, in everything. Good, Grace said, picking up her purse and the job offer tablet. Then let's go show them what we can do. As they walked toward the door, Alexander caught her hand one more time. Grace? For what it's worth, I think you're going to revolutionize their entire operation. How can you be so sure? Alexander smiled. Because in 24 hours, you've revolutionized mine. The conference room awaited, along with the most important interview of Grace's life. But for the first time since boarding that plane, she felt ready for whatever came next. After all, she'd already survived the impossible. Now it was time to see what she could build from it. Grace walked out of the conference room 90 minutes later feeling like she'd just run a marathon and won. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with possibility, and her hand was slightly sore from all the firm handshakes with the Meridian Group's executive team. Alexander was waiting in the hallway, leaning against the wall with an expression of barely contained anticipation. The moment he saw her face, his own broke into a grin. Well, he asked, pushing off from the wall. "They offered me the job," Grace said, and then she laughed, a sound of pure, unfiltered joy that echoed through the hallway. "Alexander, they actually offered me the job." Before either of them could think about it, Alexander swept her up in his arms, spinning her around as she laughed. When he set her down, they were standing much closer than before, and Grace could see gold flecks in his green eyes that she'd never noticed. "Tell me everything," he said, his hands still resting lightly on her waist. "Dr. Williams, their chief medical officer, said my ideas about integrating preventive care with luxury hospitality were exactly what they'd been looking for. And Maria Santos, their operations director, loved my suggestion about creating wellness programs specifically designed for healthcare workers." Grace pulled out her phone, scrolling through the notes she'd taken. "They want me to start with a 3-month trial period to develop a comprehensive medical tourism program. If it works out, the position becomes permanent with a 5-year contract. And the salary? Enough to pay off my mother's medical bills, cover Jasmine's remaining tuition, and still have money left over for things like groceries and maybe even a savings account." Grace shook her head in amazement. "I keep waiting to wake up." Alexander reached out and gently pinched her arm. "Ow. What was that for?" "Just checking." "Still awake?" Alexander's smile was teasing, but his eyes were serious. "Grace, you earned this. Every bit of it." They walked out of the resort lobby and onto the beach, where the December sun felt like a warm embrace after Chicago's bitter cold. Grace kicked off her heels and carried them, letting her toes sink into the white sand. "I called my mom during the break," Grace said, pulling out her phone. "Listen to this." She played a voicemail, and her mother's voice filled the space between them. "Gracie, baby, I am so proud of you I could burst. You sound so happy, so excited. I haven't heard you sound like this since you were little and you discovered something wonderful. Take the job, sweetheart. Take it and don't look back. You deserve every bit of happiness coming your way." Alexander saw tears gathering in Grace's eyes. "She sounds like an amazing woman." "She is. She worked 2 jobs my entire childhood so I could focus on school. When I told her about nursing school, she picked up a 3rd job to help pay for it." Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "For the first time in my life, I get to call her with good news instead of asking for help." They found a quiet spot on the beach where someone had arranged 2 lounge chairs under a palm tree. Grace settled into one, and Alexander took the other, both of them watching the waves roll in. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said, turning to face him. "Anything. What's the real reason you wanted to help me succeed today? And don't say it's because you're falling for me, because we've known each other for 2 days." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, watching a pelican dive for fish in the distance. "Do you remember when I told you about my sister? Rebecca. She died in the accident with your parents. What I didn't tell you is that Rebecca was a social worker. She worked with kids in foster care, helping them transition to permanent families." Alexander's voice grew soft. "She made a fraction of what I made even back then, but she was the happiest person I knew." Grace waited, sensing there was more. "The night before the accident, we had dinner together. She was telling me about this little girl she'd been working with, 7 years old, who'd been in 6 different homes and was convinced no one would ever want to keep her permanently." Alexander picked up a handful of sand and let it run through his fingers. Rebecca had been working for months to find this girl the right family. She'd go to work early, stay late, spend her own money on clothes and books for the kid. She was completely invested. Did she find her a family? She did. The adoption was finalized a week after the funeral. Alexander looked at Grace directly. Rebecca never got to see it happen, but she'd set everything in motion. She'd changed that little girl's entire life, and she didn't even get to witness the outcome. Grace felt her chest tighten with emotion. Alexander. Watching you today, seeing how passionate you were about helping people, how naturally you talked about making healthcare more accessible and compassionate, it reminded me of Rebecca. And I realized that maybe this was my chance to do what I couldn't do for my sister. What do you mean? I couldn't save Rebecca, but I could help someone else achieve their dream of helping people. I could use my resources to make sure someone with your heart and talent had the opportunity to change lives. Alexander's voice grew thick with emotion. It wasn't about charity, Grace. It was about purpose. Grace reached over and took his hand. Thank you for telling me that. There's something else, Alexander said, squeezing her fingers. After Rebecca died, I threw myself into business because it was the only thing that made sense. Numbers, deals, profit margins, they were predictable. They couldn't hurt me the way losing people could. But they couldn't make you happy either. No, they couldn't. And I convinced myself that happiness wasn't the point. That success was enough. Alexander turned to face her fully. But being with you these past 2 days, I've remembered what it feels like to care about something more than quarterly earnings. To want something more than the next acquisition. Grace felt her heart racing. What do you want now? I want to wake up excited about the day instead of dreading another meeting. I want to use my money and influence to actually help people instead of just accumulating more of both. I want to travel somewhere because I want to see it, not because there's a deal to be made. Alexander paused, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. And I want to do all of that with someone who understands what it means to work for something greater than yourself. Grace felt tears welling up again, but these were different, tears of hope rather than fear. Alexander, I need you to know something. Whatever happens between us, you've already given me the greatest gift anyone ever has. What's that? You've made me believe I'm worth investing in. You've shown me that my dreams don't have to be small just because my bank account is. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ocean and processing the magnitude of everything that had happened. Grace's phone buzzed with a text from Jasmine. Mom told me about the job offer. Grace, this is incredible. I'm so proud of you I could cry. You've spent so many years taking care of everyone else, you deserve this happiness. Grace showed Alexander the message, and his smile was soft and genuine. Your family really loves you, he said. They do. And for the first time, I feel like I love myself enough to accept something good. Grace stretched in her chair, feeling the sun warm her skin. Can I tell you something that might sound crazy? After the past 2 days, I'm pretty sure nothing will sound crazy anymore. Grace laughed. I feel like I've been holding my breath for 8 years, and I can finally exhale. Like I've been waiting for permission to want more from my life, and somehow you and this opportunity gave me that permission. Grace, you didn't need anyone's permission. That strength, that ambition, that hope, it was always yours. Maybe. But sometimes we need someone else to see our potential before we can see it ourselves. Alexander stood up and extended his hand to her. Come on. We're celebrating. How? However you want. This is your day, Grace Patterson. How do you want to spend the afternoon when you're not worried about money or schedules or anyone else's needs? Grace took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. She looked around at the pristine beach, the crystal clear water, the endless blue sky, and felt a sense of freedom she'd never experienced before. I want to go swimming, she said suddenly. I want to swim in the Caribbean Sea and not worry about anything except how good the water feels. Do you have a swimsuit? Grace grinned. I'm sure the resort boutique has something that will work. And for the first time in my life, I can actually afford to buy it. The most powerful moments aren't the big dramatic gestures, they're the quiet realizations that our lives can be different. What's one dream you've been afraid to pursue? Share it in the comments below and maybe inspire someone else to take their own leap of faith. An hour later, Grace emerged from her hotel room wearing a bright turquoise bikini that brought out the warm undertones in her brown skin. She'd left her hair down, and it fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She felt beautiful, confident, and more like herself than she had in years. Alexander was waiting by the pool, wearing navy blue swim trunks and a white t-shirt. When he saw her, his expression was one of pure appreciation, not just for how she looked, but for the confidence radiating from her. Ready? He asked. More than ready. They walked to the beach together, and Grace didn't hesitate before running straight into the waves. The water was perfectly warm, clear enough to see her feet, and felt like liquid silk against her skin. Alexander followed, and soon they were floating together in the gentle swells, the afternoon sun creating diamonds on the water's surface around them. Grace, Alexander said, treading water beside her. Yeah? I know this is all happening fast, and I know you need time to process everything. But I want you to know that regardless of what you decide about the job, regardless of where this goes between us, these 2 days have been the best of my life. Grace floated on her back, looking up at the cloudless sky. Alexander, can I ask you something without you taking it the wrong way? Of course. If I wasn't a nurse from Chicago, if I wasn't someone you felt you could help or save or fix, would you still be interested in me? Alexander stopped treading water for a moment, surprised by the directness of the question. Grace, look at me. She turned upright in the water, meeting his eyes. I'm not interested in you because you need help. I'm interested in you because you're brilliant, compassionate, funny, and stronger than anyone I've ever met. I'm interested in you because you make me want to be a better person. Alexander moved closer, the water lapping between them. I'm interested in you because when you smile, really smile, it's like watching the sun come up. Grace felt her heart flutter. That's a very good answer. It's the only answer, because it's the truth. They swam for another hour, sometimes talking, sometimes just enjoying the silence and the sensation of floating in paradise. As the afternoon wore on, other guests began to populate the beach, but Grace and Alexander remained in their own little bubble of contentment. Eventually, they made their way back to the lounge chairs, where Grace wrapped herself in a resort towel and Alexander ordered them both cold drinks from a passing server. So what happens next? Grace asked, sipping her passion fruit smoothie. Well, you have 3 days to give Meridian Group your answer about the job. And we have. Alexander paused, calculating. 36 hours before my flight back to New York. And then? And then we figure it out. If you take the job, you'll need time to relocate, wrap up your life in Chicago, help your family adjust to the changes. If you don't take it, you go back to Northwestern Memorial and I go back to my penthouse, and we see if this was just a beautiful interlude or something that can survive real life. Grace considered this. What do you think it is? Honestly, I think you're going to take the job, and I think I'm going to find excuses to visit Barbados a lot more often than I ever have before. What about your business in New York? Alexander smiled. Grace, one of the benefits of being successful is that you can afford to delegate. I've been micromanaging every aspect of my company for 10 years because I didn't have anything else I wanted to do with my time. And now you do? Now I have someone I want to build something with. Something that's bigger than just business or just career success. Grace felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the Caribbean sun. Alexander, I need you to promise me something else. Name it. Promise me that if we do this, if we try to build something together, you'll tell me if I ever start taking your generosity for granted. Promise me you'll call me out if I start expecting things instead of appreciating them. Alexander reached over and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. Grace, you've been grateful for a cup of coffee made the way you like it. I'm not worried about you taking anything for granted. But promise me anyway. I promise. But only if you promise me something in return. What? Promise me you'll tell me if I ever make you feel like you owe me something for helping with your career. Promise me you'll remind me that what we have isn't about what I can give you, but about who we are together. Grace nodded solemnly. I promise. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Grace realized she was experiencing something she'd never had before, a perfect day. A day where she didn't worry about money or responsibilities or anyone else's needs. A day that was just hers, spent with someone who made her feel valued and cherished and hopeful about the future. Alexander, she said softly. Yeah? Thank you for showing me what it feels like to believe in happily ever after. Alexander leaned over and kissed her forehead gently. Grace, I think our story is just getting started. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Grace Patterson, former overworked nurse from Chicago, current director-elect of wellness services in Paradise, realized that sometimes the best things in life really do happen when you least expect them. But their fairy tale was about to face its biggest test yet. Grace woke up the next morning with a smile already on her face, the Caribbean sun streaming through her hotel room windows like a golden promise. She'd slept better than she had in months, her dreams filled with images of her new life, working alongside brilliant colleagues, helping transform healthcare delivery, building something meaningful with Alexander. She dressed carefully in a flowing coral sundress that complemented her skin tone, applied a touch of mascara, and headed down to meet Alexander for breakfast. They'd planned to spend the morning exploring Bridgetown before her afternoon meeting with Dr. Williams to discuss contract details. The elevator descended with a soft chime, and Grace practically floated into the marble-floored lobby, her heart light with anticipation. She spotted Alexander immediately. He was standing near the concierge desk, wearing khaki slacks and a crisp white button-down that made his green eyes even more striking. But he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, tall and elegant in a way that spoke of expensive education and designer everything. Her platinum blonde hair was swept into a perfect chignon, and she wore a navy blue power suit that probably cost more than Grace made in a month. She had her hand on Alexander's arm in a gesture that was both possessive and intimate. Grace slowed her approach, something cold settling in her stomach as she watched their interaction. The woman was speaking in low, urgent tones, and Alexander's expression was tense, focused, the same look he'd worn during their first conversation about business. Alexander, darling, you can't be serious about this little fantasy, the woman was saying as Grace moved close enough to hear. Her accent was cultured, probably East Coast elite. I know you've been under tremendous stress lately, but this is exactly the kind of impulsive behavior that could damage everything we've worked for. Grace froze behind a large tropical plant arrangement, her heart beginning to race with a sick kind of anticipation. Margaret, we've discussed this, Alexander started, but the woman cut him off. No, we haven't discussed it. You disappeared for 2 days with some random woman you met by accident, and now you're talking about completely restructuring your life? This isn't like you, Alexander. This is irrational. Margaret. Alexander's assistant. The one who'd been supposed to meet him at the airport. My personal life isn't a business decision, Alexander said, his voice carefully controlled. Margaret laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, sweetheart, you don't have a personal life. You have carefully managed public relations and strategic networking. And right now, you're risking both for what? A vacation fling with a nurse from Chicago? Grace felt each word like a physical blow. The way Margaret said nurse made it sound like an insult, like something beneath consideration. That's enough, Alexander said, his tone warning. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been thinking with something other than your brain. Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled through something. I've been fielding calls from 3 different newspapers about your mysterious disappearance. The board is asking questions. And the Hartwell deal is hanging by a thread because you missed yesterday's conference call. Grace pressed herself against the plant, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. This was the real world intruding on their bubble of paradise, and it sounded nothing like the fairy tale she'd been living. The Hartwell acquisition can wait, Alexander said, but Grace could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. Can it? Because they're meeting with Cameron Industries this afternoon. If we lose this deal because you were playing house with some woman you barely know. Margaret let the sentence hang in the air like a threat. Grace isn't some woman, Alexander said, and Grace felt a flicker of hope. Isn't she? Margaret's voice turned calculating. Alexander, what do you actually know about her? Her background, her finances, her motivations? How do you know she didn't orchestrate this entire meeting? How do you know she's not after exactly what everyone else is after? Grace felt the blood drain from her face. The implication was clear, that she was some kind of gold digger, that everything between them had been calculated manipulation on her part. You're being ridiculous, Alexander said, but Grace could hear doubt creeping into his voice for the first time since they met. Am I? A nurse from Chicago just happens to board the wrong plane and end up with one of the wealthiest men in America? And then just happens to need help with her career? And you just happen to have exactly the connections she needs? Margaret's tone was poisonous. Darling, I've seen a dozen women try variations of this exact same approach. Grace's hands were shaking now. She wanted to run, to disappear before she had to hear Alexander's response, but her feet seemed rooted to the marble floor. Margaret, I need you to stop talking about Grace that way, Alexander said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held moments before. I'm trying to protect you, Alexander. The way I always have. The way your parents would have wanted me to. Margaret's voice softened, becoming almost maternal. You know I care about you. You know I only want what's best for you and the company. Grace saw Alexander run a hand through his hair. The gesture she'd learned meant he was stressed or uncertain. The truth is, Margaret continued, you can't afford this kind of distraction right now. The IPO is 6 months away. The Hartwell deal could make or break our market position. And you're talking about restructuring your entire life for a woman you met 3 days ago? 3 days. When Margaret said it like that, it sounded impossibly brief, impossibly naive. I care about her, Alexander said quietly. I'm sure you do. She seems lovely. But caring about someone and appending your entire existence for them are 2 different things. Margaret's voice took on a pragmatic tone. If she's really interested in you and not what you can provide, she'll understand that your responsibilities have to come first. Grace felt tears beginning to burn behind her eyes. She thought about her conversation with Alexander the day before, about how she'd made him promise to tell her if she ever started taking his generosity for granted. But what if Margaret was right? What if, Without meaning to, she'd already done exactly that. What exactly are you suggesting? Alexander asked. Come back to New York. Today. Handle the Hartwell situation, get the company back on track, take some time to think clearly about this situation. Margaret paused. If it's real, it'll survive a few weeks of separation. If it's not. And Grace? Grace held her breath, waiting for Margaret's response. If she takes the job with Meridian, wonderful. You've helped someone, which I know makes you feel good. If she doesn't, then you'll know her true motivations. Margaret's voice became gentle, almost kind. Alexander, I've watched you build this empire from nothing. Don't let a pretty face and a sob story undo everything you've accomplished. Grace couldn't listen anymore. She turned and walked quickly toward the elevator, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall in public. Behind her, she could hear Margaret continuing to speak, but the words blended into a buzzing sound that matched the ringing in her ears. The elevator doors closed just as Alexander looked up and caught sight of her retreating figure. Have you ever had someone make you question your own worth just when you were starting to believe in yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We all need reminders that other people's doubts don't define our value. Grace made it to her room before the tears came in earnest. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the coral dress she'd chosen so carefully that morning, and let herself cry for the fairy tale that was crumbling around her. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. Where are you? I'm in the lobby looking for you. She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. What could she say? That she'd overheard his assistant basically calling her a gold digger? That every word Margaret had spoken had struck at insecurities Grace didn't even know she had? Another text. Grace, please. Something's wrong and I need to explain. A knock at her door made her jump. Grace? It's me. Please open the door. Grace wiped her eyes and walked to the door, but didn't open it. I'm here. Can I come in? We need to talk. I heard you talking, Alexander. With Margaret. Silence on the other side of the door. How much did you hear? His voice was quiet, careful. Enough. Grace leaned her forehead against the door. Enough to know that she's probably right. Grace, please open the door. Let me explain what's happening. What's happening is that the real world is reminding us both that fairy tales don't actually exist. Grace's voice was steady despite the tears still flowing down her cheeks. What's happening is that I almost let myself believe I could have something that was never really mine to begin with. That's not true. Isn't it? Grace stepped back from the door. Alexander, we've known each other for 3 days. 3 days. And in that time, I've let you reorganize my entire career, introduce me to people I never would have met, open doors I never could have opened myself. I wanted to help. I know you did. And that's exactly the problem. Grace sank into the chair by the window, looking out at the beach where they'd been so happy just hours before. Margaret was right about one thing. How do you know I didn't manipulate this whole situation? How do you know I'm not exactly like all the other women who've tried to use you? Because I know you, Alexander said through the door. You know me after 3 days? You know that I'm not someone who could be tempted by wealth and security and the promise of never having to worry about money again? Grace laughed bitterly. Alexander, I've been broke my entire adult life. I've chosen between groceries and gas money. I've worked 14-hour shifts and still couldn't pay all my bills. How do you know that when someone like you offered me a way out, I didn't take it regardless of my feelings? The silence stretched between them, and Grace knew her words had found their mark. "Grace, please don't do this. Don't let Margaret's cynicism poison what we have." "What do we have?" Grace asked. "Really? We have 3 perfect days in paradise where you solved all my problems with a few phone calls. We have a fantasy where I get to pretend I'm the kind of woman who belongs in your world." "You do belong." "No, I don't." Grace stood up, pacing to the window. "I don't know how to navigate your world, Alexander. I don't know the rules or the expectations or the politics. I don't know how to be with someone who has board meetings and IPOs and assistants who've been with him longer than I've been a nurse. None of that matters." "It all matters." Grace pressed her hand against the glass. "Your assistant thinks I'm a gold digger. Your business is suffering because you've been distracted. You've missed important calls and meetings because you were helping me. Those things can be handled. Can they? And what happens the next time? What happens when choosing me means losing a deal or disappointing people who depend on you?" Grace turned away from the window. "What happens when you start to resent me for being the complication that your perfectly ordered life didn't need?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was strained. "Grace, I would never resent you. You say that now. But Margaret's right about something else. You have responsibilities. You have people depending on you, companies to run, decisions that affect thousands of jobs." Grace sat back down, suddenly exhausted. "And I'm just a nurse from Chicago who accidentally got in the way of all of that." "You're not in the way of anything." "Then prove it," Grace said quietly. "What?" "Go back to New York. Handle your business. Take care of the things that were important to you before you met me." Grace's voice was steady now, resolved. "If what we have is real, it'll survive you putting your actual life first." "Grace, no. I'm not leaving you here like this." "Yes, you are. Because if you don't, I'll always wonder if I'm just another responsibility you feel obligated to manage." Grace stood up and walked back to the door, placing her palm against it. "I need to know that if you choose me, it's because you want to, not because you feel sorry for me or guilty about leaving. I do want to choose you. Then choose yourself first. Choose your company, your responsibilities, your real life. Handle whatever crisis Margaret says you're facing." Grace's voice was firm despite the tears. "And if, after you've done that, after you've taken care of everything that was important before I accidentally stumbled into your world, if you still want to try this, then we'll talk." "Grace." "I'm going to turn down the job," she said suddenly. "What?" "No. You can't do that." "Yes, I can. Because Margaret was right about something else. I need to know my own motivations. I need to know if I'm taking this job because it's right for me or because you made it possible." Grace leaned against the door. "I'm going back to Chicago tomorrow. I'm going back to Northwestern Memorial, to my real life, to the person I was before any of this happened. Grace, please don't make decisions based on what Margaret said." "I'm not. I'm making decisions based on what I know about myself." Grace closed her eyes. "Alexander, I've spent my entire adult life being grateful for whatever I could get. I've accepted smaller dreams because they seemed more realistic. I've settled for less because I thought it was all I deserved." She paused, gathering her courage for what she needed to say next. "For 3 days, you made me believe I deserved more. You made me believe I was worth investing in, worth taking risks for, worth building something beautiful with." Grace's voice broke slightly. "But I need to know that I can create that worth myself, without your connections or your money or your influence." I need to know that I'm enough on my own before I can be enough for someone else." The hallway was quiet for so long that Grace wondered if Alexander had left. Finally, his voice came through the door, thick with emotion. "You are enough, Grace. You've always been enough. Then let me prove it to myself." Grace heard him lean against the door on his side, imagining she could feel his presence through the wood. "What if I come back in a month?" he asked quietly. "What if I handle everything in New York and then come find you in Chicago? Then I guess we'll see what happens when the fairy tale has to survive in the real world." Grace listened to his footsteps as he walked away, each one echoing in the silence like a door closing. She sat in her room for the rest of the morning, watching the waves roll in and out, trying to convince herself she'd made the right choice. At noon, her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Williams asking if she was still planning to attend their afternoon meeting. Grace stared at the message for a long time before typing her response. "I'm sorry, but I've decided to decline the position. Thank you for the opportunity." An hour later, she was on a plane back to Miami, and then Chicago, leaving paradise behind and carrying with her the bittersweet knowledge that sometimes loving someone means walking away before either of you gets hurt worse than you can recover from. As the island grew smaller beneath the clouds, Grace pressed her face to the window and whispered a prayer that she'd made the right choice, even though her heart felt like it was breaking with every mile that carried her away from the man who'd shown her what it felt like to be truly seen and valued. The fairy tale was over. Now came the hard part, learning to live with the memory of what could have been, and finding the strength to build a life worthy of the woman Alexander had helped her remember she could be. But love, Grace was about to discover, has a way of refusing to stay buried, even when pride and fear try their hardest to kill it. Grace stared at her reflection in the hospital bathroom mirror, adjusting her familiar royal blue scrubs for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The fluorescent lights cast the same harsh glow they always had, but somehow she looked different, older maybe, or perhaps just sadder. The coral tan she'd gained in Barbados was already fading in Chicago's December gloom, like evidence of a dream she was trying to convince herself had never happened. Her hands shook slightly as she tied her hair back into its usual ponytail. 48 hours ago, she'd been walking on a beach with Alexander, talking about building something beautiful together. Now she was back in her real life, preparing for another 14-hour shift that would pay her just enough to cover rent and groceries, if she was careful. "Patterson, you're back early." Nancy, her supervisor, appeared in the doorway with her usual harried expression. "I thought you were taking the week off." "Change of plans," Grace said, forcing a smile. "Where do you need me?" "Room 318. Mrs. Henderson's been asking for you every shift since you left. Well, you should probably go see her first." Grace's stomach dropped. Mrs. Henderson's room was in the terminal ward. She found the elderly woman propped up in bed, looking smaller and frilier than she had just days before. But her eyes still held that familiar warmth, and she smiled when Grace entered. "There's my angel," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her voice even weaker than Grace remembered. "I was hoping you'd come back before." Grace pulled the chair close to the bed, the same chair she'd sat in 3 nights ago when Mrs. Henderson had told her not to forget to live her own life. "I'm here. How are you feeling?" "Like I'm ready for whatever comes next," Mrs. Henderson said with surprising peace. "But first, I want to hear about your adventure. You look different, dear. Something happened while you were away." Grace felt tears threatening. "It's not important right now. Let's focus on you. Grace Patterson, don't you dare waste time coddling a dying old woman when you've got a story to tell." Mrs. Henderson's voice carried a hint of her old strength. "Did you take my advice? Did you live a little?" Despite everything, Grace found herself smiling. I did. For 3 days, I lived more than I have in years. And it's over now. I'm back where I belong. Mrs. Henderson studied her with sharp eyes. Where you belong, or where you're hiding? Grace looked down at her hands. Mrs. Henderson, I met someone. Someone incredible. But we're from completely different worlds, and I realized that sometimes loving someone means knowing when to walk away. Oh, honey. Mrs. Henderson reached for Grace's hand with fingers that felt fragile as bird bones. Tell me about him. So Grace did. She told Mrs. Henderson about the mistaken boarding, about Alexander's kindness, about the beach and the conversations and the way he'd made her feel like she was worth investing in. She told her about the job offer, about Margaret's words, about the choice to leave before either of them got hurt worse. When she finished, Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. Grace, in my 87 years, I've learned that there are two kinds of people in this world, those who let fear make their choices, and those who let love make them. Mrs. Henderson's grip on Grace's hand tightened. Which one are you? I'm being realistic. You're being scared. Mrs. Henderson's tone was gentle but firm. And I understand that. When my Harold first asked me to marry him, I turned him down. Told him we were too different, that it would never work. You know what he did? Grace shook her head. He waited. For 6 months, he waited while I figured out that being afraid of getting hurt was hurting me more than any heartbreak ever could. Mrs. Henderson smiled at the memory. Then he showed up at my door with a ring and said, I'm not asking you to stop being scared. I'm asking you to be scared with me instead of without me. Grace felt fresh tears starting. But what if it doesn't work? What if? What if it does? Mrs. Henderson interrupted. Grace, you've spent your whole life playing it safe, taking care of everyone else, making the practical choice. How has that worked out for you? Grace didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. I'm dying, dear, Mrs. Henderson said matter-of-factly. And do you know what my biggest regret is? Not the chances I took that didn't work out. It's the chances I didn't take because I was too afraid of failing. Before Grace could respond, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Grace, this is Margaret Webb, Alexander's assistant. I owe you an apology. Could we talk? I'm in Chicago. Grace stared at the message, her heart racing. Mrs. Henderson, I need to go, the older woman said firmly. And Grace? Whatever you decide, make sure it's because you're moving towards something, not running away from it. Grace found Margaret sitting on a bench near the bean, looking oddly out of place in her expensive coat and designer heels. The December wind whipped through the park, sending snow flurries dancing around them like confetti. Thank you for meeting me, Margaret said as Grace approached. Up close, she looked tired, older than she had in Barbados. I wasn't sure you would. Grace sat down beside her, maintaining careful distance. What are you doing in Chicago? Cleaning up my mess, Margaret said simply. Grace, I owe you a sincere apology. What I said about you in Barbados was unfair, unkind, and completely wrong. Grace stared at her, surprised by the admission. I've been Alexander's assistant for 12 years, Margaret continued. I've watched dozens of women try to manipulate him, use him, hurt him. I thought I was protecting him, but I realize now that I was protecting myself. What do you mean? Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching the snow fall. Alexander is the closest thing I have to family. When his parents died, when his sister died, I was there. I helped him build his empire from the ground up. I've organized his entire life for over a decade. She turned to look at Grace directly. And then you came along, and for the first time since I've known him, he was genuinely happy. Not successful, not accomplished, not wealthy, happy. And I was terrified that if he found real love, real partnership, he wouldn't need me anymore. Grace felt a knot in her stomach loosening slightly. Margaret. Let me finish, please. Margaret pulled a tablet from her purse. I spent the last 2 days investigating you. Not because I thought you were a fraud, but because I wanted to prove to myself that you were. Do you know what I found? Grace shook her head. 8 years of perfect employment records. Commendations for patient care. Volunteer work at 3 different homeless shelters. A college scholarship you turned down to take care of your sick mother. A nursing degree you earned while working full-time. Margaret's voice grew softer. I found a woman who spent her entire adult life putting everyone else's needs before her own, just like Alexander has. Grace felt tears starting again. I also found this. Margaret handed her the tablet, showing a video call interface. Alexander's been calling me every 2 hours since yesterday, begging me to tell him how to fix what I broke. He's miserable, Grace. Absolutely miserable. Margaret, why are you telling me this? Because I realized something. In 12 years of knowing Alexander, I've never seen him cry. Not when his parents died, not when his sister died, not during any of the business disasters or personal betrayals. Margaret's voice was thick with emotion. But yesterday, when he thought he'd lost you because of my interference, he broke down completely. And I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. Grace stared at the tablet, her heart hammering. He loves you, Margaret continued. Really loves you. Not because you need saving, not because you're grateful for his help, but because you're the first person in years who sees him as just Alexander, not as a bank account or a business opportunity. But the business will survive. The Hartwell deal went through this morning. The company is fine. Alexander is not. Margaret touched Grace's arm gently. Grace, he resigned from 2 board positions yesterday. He's restructuring his entire company so he can step back from day-to-day operations. He's doing everything he can to build a life that has room for love in it. Grace felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. What do you want me to do? I want you to make whatever choice will make you happy, Margaret said. But I also want you to know that if you choose him, I'll do everything in my power to support that choice instead of sabotaging it. Margaret stood up, wrapping her coat tighter against the wind. He's at the Ritz-Carlton downtown. Room 2847. He's been there since last night, hoping you'd give him another chance to explain. She paused. Grace, I've spent 12 years watching Alexander build walls around his heart. Don't let my fear be the reason he has to keep them up. Grace stood outside Alexander's hotel room door for 10 minutes before finding the courage to knock. She'd changed out of her scrubs into jeans and a soft green sweater, and her hair was down around her shoulders for the first time since their last day in Barbados. When the door opened, Alexander looked like he hadn't slept since she'd last seen him. His hair was disheveled, he was wearing a wrinkled button-down and dark jeans, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and emotion. Grace, he breathed, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Hi, she said softly. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the threshold, both afraid to break the fragile moment with words that might send the other running again. Can I come in? Grace asked finally. Alexander stepped back immediately, ushering her into a suite that was elegant but not ostentatious, nothing like the penthouse she'd imagined in New York. The curtains were open to show the Chicago skyline, and Grace could see Lake Michigan in the distance, gray and choppy under the winter sky. "Margaret said you've been here since yesterday," Grace said, settling into one of the armchairs by the window. "I couldn't leave. Not when there was still a chance you might." Alexander sat across from her, close enough that she could see the genuine pain in his eyes. "Grace, I'm so sorry about what happened in Barbados. About Margaret, about the things she said." She apologized. Grace interrupted. "This afternoon." She explained why she said what she said. Alexander looked surprised. "She did?" "Alexander, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Grace leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "When you were listening to Margaret talk about your responsibilities, about the business, about how I was a distraction from your real life, did any part of you think she was right?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and Grace's heart sank. "Yes," he said finally, and Grace felt the last of her hope crumble. "I thought for about 30 seconds that maybe she was right," Alexander continued, "that maybe I was being irresponsible, that maybe I was letting my feelings cloud my judgment." He looked directly into her eyes. "And then I realized that for the first time in 10 years, I was making decisions based on what would make me happy instead of what would make me money. And that scared me." Grace felt her breath catch. "Grace, I've spent the last decade building an empire because I thought success would fill the empty places my family left behind. I thought if I was wealthy enough, powerful enough, important enough, I'd stop feeling like I was just alone." Alexander's voice was raw with honesty. "But when I met you, all of that stopped mattering. For 3 days, I wasn't a billionaire or a CEO or an acquisition target. I was just a man who'd found someone who made him want to be better." Tears were flowing freely down Grace's cheeks now. "When Margaret was talking about all my responsibilities, all the people depending on me, all the reasons why loving you was impractical, I realized she was describing a life I'd built to avoid having to be vulnerable with another human being." Alexander leaned forward, his voice intense. "And I don't want that life anymore, Grace. I want a life with you in it. But your company will run perfectly well without me micromanaging every decision. I hired good people, Grace. I can trust them to do their jobs while I learn how to have a life that's about more than work." Alexander reached across the space between them, covering her hands with his. "I resigned from half my board positions yesterday. I'm restructuring Kane Industries so I can step back from daily operations. I'm building a life that has room for love in it." Grace looked down at their joined hands. "Alexander, I turned down the job in Barbados." "I know. Dr. Williams called me. I turned it down because I needed to know I could be enough on my own before I could be enough for someone else." "And?" Alexander's voice was careful, hopeful. Grace looked up at him, seeing in his face the same vulnerability she'd been fighting in herself. "I spent the last 2 days trying to convince myself I'd made the right choice. I went back to work, back to my old life, back to being practical and safe and realistic." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "And I was miserable. Not because my old life was bad, but because you'd shown me what it felt like to dream bigger, to want more, to believe I deserved happiness." Grace squeezed his hands. "Mrs. Henderson, one of my patients, asked me today if I was letting fear make my choices or letting love make them. What did you tell her?" "I told her I was still figuring it out." Grace smiled through her tears. "But I think I know now." Alexander waited, hardly breathing. "I want to choose love, Grace said simply. I want to choose the scary, impractical, completely uncertain possibility that what we found in Barbados can survive in the real world. What would you choose, the safety of the known or the risk of extraordinary love? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you believe love is worth fighting for. Alexander pulled her into his arms then, holding her tight against his chest as if he was afraid she might disappear again. Grace could feel his heart pounding against her cheek, could hear him whispering her name like a prayer. I love you, he said into her hair. I love your compassion and your strength and the way you make me want to be worthy of you. I love that you walked away when you thought staying would hurt us both. I love that you came back when you realized love was worth the risk. Grace pulled back to look at his face, seeing in his eyes the same wonder and terror and overwhelming happiness she felt in her own heart. I love you too, she whispered. I love your kindness and your vulnerability and the way you see potential in people even when they can't see it in themselves. I love that you were willing to restructure your entire life for the possibility of building something real with me. When he kissed her, Grace felt like she was coming home to a place she'd never known she was looking for. It was soft and desperate and full of promise, a kiss that tasted like second chances and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. So what happens now? Grace asked. Now we figure it out together, Alexander said. We take it one day at a time, one choice at a time, one leap of faith at a time. What about my job? My life here? What about it? I love Chicago. I can work from anywhere. And if you want to stay at Northwestern Memorial, I'll support that completely. If you want to explore other opportunities, I'll support that too. Alexander cupped her face in his hands. Grace, I'm not trying to rescue you or fix your life. I'm asking you to build a new life with me. Grace felt a smile spreading across her face, the first genuine smile she'd worn since leaving Barbados. Okay, she said simply. Okay? Okay, let's build something beautiful together. Grace laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. Let's see what happens when two people decide to choose love over fear. Alexander spun her around the hotel room, both of them laughing like children, both of them giddy with the relief of finding their way back to each other. Outside the windows, Chicago glittered in the early evening darkness, a city full of millions of people living their own stories of love and loss and second chances. But inside room 2847, two hearts that had almost given up on love were learning to beat in sync again, preparing to write the next chapter of their story together. The choice had been made. Now came the beautiful, terrifying, completely uncertain adventure of learning to love without walls, to trust without guarantees, and to believe that sometimes the best things in life really do happen when you're brave enough to take the leap. The sound of steel drums drifted across the beach as Grace adjusted the flowing emerald dress that caught the late afternoon breeze perfectly. She stood at the edge of the same stretch of sand where she and Alexander had first walked together 4 months ago, but everything was different now, and somehow exactly as it was meant to be. You ready for this? Kelly asked, appearing beside her with a wide grin. Grace's former roommate had flown down from Chicago along with Grace's mother, sister, and a handful of friends who still couldn't quite believe this fairy tale was real. I've been ready since the moment I decided to stop running, Grace replied, her eyes scanning the small gathering of people seated in white chairs facing the ocean. Mrs. Henderson's son sat in the front row, representing the woman who'd given Grace the push she needed to choose love over fear. The elderly woman had passed peacefully 2 weeks after Grace and Alexander's reunion, but not before making Grace promise to invite her to the wedding in spirit. Margaret stood near the makeshift altar they'd constructed from driftwood and tropical flowers, no longer Alexander's assistant but his friend, And surprisingly, Grace's too. She'd been the one to suggest Barbados for the ceremony, insisting it was only fitting they marry where their story truly began. "He's lucky to have found you," came a familiar voice. Grace turned to see Dr. Williams approaching, elegant in a coral dress that complemented her dark skin beautifully. "Though I suspect you're both exactly where you're supposed to be." Grace smiled, remembering their conversation at the medical conference that felt like a lifetime ago. "Thank you for everything, Dr. Williams. For the opportunity, for the advice, for believing in possibilities I couldn't see yet. Sometimes we need others to see our potential before we can claim it ourselves," Dr. Williams replied with a knowing smile. "Your new clinic is going to change lives, Grace. Both the patients you'll serve and your own." The Kane Foundation Medical Center was set to open in 6 months, a state-of-the-art facility in Chicago's South Side that would provide free healthcare to underserved communities. Grace would serve as head nurse and program coordinator, a position that combined her passion for patient care with her newfound confidence in leadership. Alexander had insisted she design every aspect of the program herself, then provided the funding to make her vision reality. "It feels too good to be true sometimes," Grace admitted. "The best things in life often do," Dr. Williams said gently. "That's how you know they're worth holding on to." A gentle guitar melody began, and Grace's heart started racing with anticipation rather than fear. This time, she was exactly where she belonged. Alexander stood beneath the driftwood arch, wearing a simple white linen shirt and khaki pants, his feet bare in the sand. The formal businessman she'd first encountered had been replaced by someone relaxed, genuinely happy, completely present. His green eyes found hers across the beach, and the smile that spread across his face was radiant with joy. Beside him stood Marcus, his best friend from college who'd flown in from San Francisco. Alexander had reconnected with several old friends over the past few months, people he'd lost touch with during his decade of single-minded business focus. Learning to make space for love had taught him to make space for all kinds of meaningful relationships. Grace's mother, Rosa, appeared at her side, elegant in navy blue with tears already shining in her eyes. "Mija, you look absolutely beautiful," she whispered, the Spanish endearment she'd used since Grace was small, carrying extra weight today. "Mom, are you sure about this? I know it's not the traditional wedding you probably imagined." "Grace Elena Patterson," Rosa interrupted firmly, "I have watched you sacrifice your own happiness for others for 28 years. If you want to marry this man on a beach in Barbados while steel drums play and waves crash in the background, then that's exactly what we're going to do." Grace felt tears threatening her carefully applied makeup. "I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart. And I love seeing you this happy." Rosa kissed her daughter's cheek gently. "Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become." As Grace walked down the sandy aisle, her bare feet sinking slightly with each step, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. For months ago, she'd been a woman who'd forgotten how to dream, living a life of careful practicality and endless sacrifice. She'd boarded the wrong plane and found the right life. Alexander's eyes never left her face as she approached, and she could see in them the same wonder she felt, the amazement that two people could find each other across all the noise and chaos of the world and recognize something true. The officiant, a local minister recommended by Dr. Williams, smiled warmly as Grace took her place beside Alexander. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today on this beautiful beach in Barbados to witness the union of Grace and Alexander, two souls who found their way to each other through what some might call chance, but what I prefer to call destiny." Alexander reached for Grace's hands, his touch steady and sure. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the waves, "I want to say something." Grace nodded, her heart full of anticipation. For months ago, I thought I had everything a person could want, Alexander said, speaking not just to Grace but to everyone gathered. Success, wealth, power, recognition. But I was living in a beautiful prison of my own making, surrounded by everything money could buy and nothing it couldn't. He squeezed Grace's hands gently. Then a woman with kind eyes and a generous heart accidentally walked into my life, and suddenly everything I thought I knew about happiness, about success, about what it means to be truly wealthy, changed completely. Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks as Alexander continued. Grace taught me that real wealth isn't measured in dollars or properties or board positions. It's measured in laughter shared with someone you love, in quiet moments of understanding, in the security of knowing someone sees your flaws and chooses to love you anyway. His voice grew thick with emotion. It's measured in the way someone can look at you and see not what you own, but who you are. The small crowd was silent except for the gentle sniffling of happy tears. So today, I'm not just marrying the woman I love, Alexander said, his eyes locked on Grace's face. I'm choosing a life where love makes the important decisions, where connection matters more than acquisition, where being truly known is more valuable than being widely admired. Grace's turn to speak felt like stepping into sunshine after years in shadow. Alexander, when I was growing up, my grandmother used to tell me that God puts people in our path exactly when we need them most, she began, her voice steady despite her emotions. I used to think that was just something people said to make sense of coincidence. She paused, gathering her thoughts as the ocean breeze lifted her hair. But standing here today, I know she was right. I needed you at exactly the moment you walked into my life, not to rescue me, but to show me what I was capable of becoming when I stopped being afraid of taking up space in the world. Alexander's eyes shined with unshed tears. You didn't try to fix my life or solve my problems or make me into someone different, Grace continued. You saw who I already was and loved me enough to help me see it too. You taught me that asking for what I want isn't selfish, that dreaming big isn't impractical, that love isn't something I have to earn through endless sacrifice. She smiled through her tears. Most importantly, you taught me that choosing love, real, honest, vulnerable love, is the bravest thing any of us can do. So today, I'm choosing courage. I'm choosing partnership. I'm choosing a life where we build something beautiful together, one brave choice at a time. The vows they'd written together came next, promises to support each other's dreams, to communicate honestly even when it was difficult, to make space for individual growth within their partnership, to remember that their love story began with taking a leap of faith and to keep taking those leaps together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander cupped Grace's face in his hands and kissed her with the same gentle intensity as their first kiss on this beach, but deeper now, richer with the knowledge of what they'd almost lost and chosen to fight for instead. The small crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Grace barely heard them over the sound of her own heartbeat and the waves and Alexander whispering "I love you," Mrs. Kane against her lips. The reception was simple and perfect, tables set up on the beach, string lights twinkling overhead as the sun painted the sky in shades of coral and gold. Local musicians played soft reggae while guests enjoyed fresh seafood and tropical fruits, and Grace had never felt more herself than she did in this moment. So what's next for the newlyweds? Marcus asked as he joined Grace and Alexander at their table, a rum punch in his hand and a genuine smile on his face. Please tell me you're actually taking a honeymoon instead of rushing back to work. 2 weeks in Fiji, Alexander replied, his arm around Grace's shoulders. No phones, no business calls, no schedules. Just us in the ocean and whatever happens. And after that? Grace leaned into Alexander's embrace, feeling perfectly content. After that, we go home to Chicago and start building our life together. The clinic opens in September. Alexander's transitioning more responsibilities to his management team, and we're looking at houses with actual yards instead of penthouses with perfect views. Don't forget the most important part, Alexander added with a grin. What's that? Marcus asked. We're going to get a dog, Grace laughed. Alexander's never had a pet, and I've always wanted one but never felt like I had time. Now we're going to have time for all sorts of things we never made space for before. Margaret appeared at their table, looking more relaxed than Grace had ever seen her. The past 4 months had been good to Alexander's former assistant. She'd started her own consulting firm and was dating a professor of literature she'd met at a coffee shop near Northwestern. I hate to interrupt, Margaret said, but there's someone who wants to say hello. She stepped aside to reveal a young woman in her early 20s with bright eyes and an infectious smile. Grace recognized her immediately from photos, Rebecca, the daughter of Dr. Williams, who was starting her pre-med program in the fall. Mrs. Kane, Rebecca said shyly, I wanted to thank you. My mom told me how you inspired her at the conference, and she's been different ever since, more excited about medicine, more passionate about making a difference. She says meeting you reminded her why she became a doctor in the first place. Grace felt her heart swell with pride and purpose. Your mother is an extraordinary woman, Rebecca. I'm honored to know her. She also told me about your clinic, Rebecca continued. I was wondering, would you consider letting me volunteer there during my summer breaks? I want to learn from someone who truly understands what it means to serve others. I would love that, Grace replied warmly. We're going to need passionate people who believe in the mission. As Rebecca walked away, Grace felt Alexander's hand squeeze hers gently. What are you thinking about? He asked softly. I'm thinking about how different everything is from where we started, Grace said, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. 4 months ago, I was going through the motions of a life that felt too small for me but too safe to leave. I was taking care of everyone else but forgetting to take care of myself. She turned to look at her new husband, still amazed that she got a call on that. And you were successful beyond most people's wildest dreams but completely isolated from any real human connection, she continued. We were both living half-lives, weren't we? Alexander nodded thoughtfully. I think we were both afraid of the same thing, being truly seen by someone else. You hid behind serving others, I hid behind achieving more. Both of us were terrified that if someone really knew us, really saw all our flaws and fears and messy humanity, they'd decide we weren't worth staying for. And now? Grace asked, though she already knew the answer. Now I know that being truly known by someone who chooses to love you anyway is the most incredible feeling in the world, Alexander said, his voice full of wonder. And I get to spend the rest of my life getting to know you better and letting you know me better. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared overhead, Grace looked around at the faces of people she loved, her family, her friends, Alexander's friends who were becoming her friends too, colleagues who'd become like family. She thought about Mrs. Henderson, who would have loved every minute of this celebration, and about her father, who would have walked her down the aisle if cancer hadn't taken him too soon. But mostly she thought about the woman she'd been 4 months ago, tired, overwhelmed, resigned to a life of quiet service and modest dreams, and marveled at how completely everything had changed when she'd finally found the courage to want more. No regrets? Alexander asked, as if reading her thoughts. Grace considered the question seriously. The past 4 months hadn't been without challenges. Learning to balance her independence with partnership, navigating the media attention that came with marrying a billionaire, adjusting to a life where money wasn't a constant worry, it had all required growth and compromise and honest conversation. But sitting here on this beach, surrounded by love and possibility, With her hand in Alexander's and her heart full of dreams they were building together, Grace couldn't imagine any other choice. "The only regret I have," she said finally, "is that it took me so long to believe I deserved this kind of happiness." "Well," Alexander said, pulling her closer as the steel drums played a slow, sweet melody and couples began dancing in the sand around them, "we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." As they swayed together under the Caribbean stars, Grace marveled at the journey that had brought them here. A tired nurse from Chicago and a lonely billionaire from New York, two people who'd forgotten how to dream, who'd found each other through a case of mistaken identity and discovered that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with getting completely lost. She'd boarded the wrong plane and found the right life. She'd taken a leap of faith and learned to fly. And as Alexander spun her around on the beach where their story began, both of them laughing with pure joy, Grace knew that this was just the beginning of their greatest adventure yet, the adventure of building a life together, one brave choice at a time, one day at a time, one moment of choosing love over fear at a time. The steel drums played on, the waves whispered their eternal rhythm against the shore, and two hearts that had almost given up on love beat in perfect sync, writing the opening chapter of their happily ever after under a sky full of stars and infinite possibility. Sometimes the biggest leap of faith leads to the most beautiful landing, and the most beautiful destinations are the ones we never planned to visit. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of unexpected love and second chances, and if you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.